You come under scrutiny in this, yeah. That's good. Okay. Interview with Paul Herlinger at Bronte. It's the 29th of July 1995. Paul, where were you born?
In Sydney. It's St Margaret's Hospital.
And what year was that?
1928.
1928. And where did you grow up?
I grew up in East Sydney, mainly around Elizabeth Bay and Potts Point.
Did you have brothers and sisters?
Had one brother, twin brother, Peter.
And, just the one brother?
Just the one brother, yes.
What are your earliest memories?
I think the earliest memory I have is living in Rumour Avenue. It must have been during the Depression. My parents had the top story of a, what would you call it, a terrace house. And it was apparently not a very pleasant place to live, although the people were rather nice. My father had got some sort of job as a manager or something of the sort at Roselle's Cinema. I remember he used to bring home comics for us, and that was probably the earliest remembrances I have. I remember he used to always take us to the Anzac processions, and it seemed to be an important day. And he never marched himself, but he was always keen to see some of the New Zealanders that he knew.
Was he a New Zealander?
No, he was born in Peru, but his people were of Austrian extraction.
Hmm. And did he had he been involved in World War I?
Yes, yes. He was on the Western Front, but I know little about that. Mm. All I know was he was very keen always to go along to the march.
Mm. So that house in Woomera Avenue, was that a residential sort of
Oh, it was
place?
Very much a residential area at that time.
Right.
Yes. The remember the fruit carts and the milk carts and bread carts going through it all the time, and of course the prop man selling his props and the rabbit hose and so on.
Well, what kind of a place was that? Was that Potts Point?
Woomera Avenue? No, that was over in Darlinghurst.
Oh, right.
Mm-hmm.
And how long did you live there?
I'd say probably a year. We must have been about 3 when we moved. I can just remember it. Before that, my mother had run a boarding house in Edgecliff, but I don't remember any of that at all.
Mm. And after you moved from Darlinghurst, where did you move?
We went to Elizabeth Bay, to the corner of Elizabeth Bay Road and Rosslyn Gardens. It was a block of flats called Kelburn Hall. It's still there.
Mm. And were your parents managing the flats?
My mother managed it, and my father helped out. He later went down to manage a block of flats in Rosslyn Gardens called Lake Mount.
Mm. So did you spend most of your childhood growing up in Elizabeth Bay?
Till 1941, I think, or 42 we were there. And then after that we spent the next 17, 18 odd years in Potts Point.
Oh. So it's all sort of in the same
yes.
area. Mm. What sort of a place, was Elizabeth Bay and Potts Point for kids in the 1930s?
I thought it was good. There were plenty of parks around, and it seemed a pleasant, leafy sort of place. You always felt you were under surveillance by all the neighbours and so on. Another pair of us wouldn't play up because we felt, somebody would dob you in, but it was a pleasant enough place.
Mm. Were there a lot of kids in the neighbourhood?
Oh, quite a few. Perhaps not as many as in other suburbs, but it always seemed quite good. And I know I always preferred living there to any forays we had into other suburbs that seemed rather bleak and desperate. You know, we had King's Cross that was very nice at that time, whereas you'd go to any other suburb and after, 6 o'clock at night they were dead, and on Sundays they didn't exist, whereas King's Cross was always alive.
Mm. Well, what kind of a kid were you?
Oh, a real sook. No, I was thoroughly awkward in all sports and so on, whereas my brother was very good at them. And if I was capable of missing a ball, I missed the ball.
Were you identical twins?
No. I suppose I could say I was the good-looking one. He had 2 heads. No, no. I was taller than he was.
Mm.
But, he was much more energetic, much more sporty-minded than I was.
Mm. Well, what sort of a family do you come from? How would you describe your family?
Normal covers a multitude of sins, doesn't it? Well, there were the 4 of us. No, Mum was an Irish woman, and Dad was, I suppose you'd have to say, basically Austrian, although he'd been accidentally born in Peru. Seemed normal. Certainly we belonged to what we'd call the working class at that time.
How would you describe your mother?
A volcano. She's capable of exploding at any moment. She seemed to have considerable charm because so many people seemed to like her, but I think we were always in fear of her because she could explode at will, and did.
Mm. And what about your father?
Oh, much more easygoing, very keen on gambling and horse racing and so on. Always very fussy about his dressing, you know. I didn't realise quite how much he was. And, a nice man.
Mm. Were they religious?
Well, Dad was Jewish, but he never practiced it. And Mum, of course, was Holy Roller, and she sent us to school, made sure we went through the Catholic system. But no, I wouldn't say she was superstitious. She was religious. But yeah, superstitious she probably was. But no.
Was that considered unusual at that time, the Catholic Jewish marriage?
Well, no one ever mentioned it to us, so whether or not they thought so or not, I don't know.
How were you treated at school?
All right. I can remember as a kid playing in Rushcutters Park when we were quite young, some kids referring to us as Dagos who didn't know us for some reason or other, and that hurt a great deal, but generally they were treated fairly well. I remember when the war came, some of the neighbours very kindly informed the authorities that my father was a German sympathiser, which of course he wasn't. But,
what was the consequence of that?
I had a visit from the security police, and you know, totally cleared, exonerated, or whatever they did. You know, they just scrubbed the whole thing. But you had that sort of person about, and of course you have them now.
Hmm. Well, did your father have an accent?
Oh yes, I didn't realise it until I heard him on the phone when I must have been about 20. That was the first time I'd ever heard him on the phone, and I was amazed that I thought he was putting it on, but of course I'd grown up with it. I didn't realise. Yes. And mother had the Irish accent until she died a couple of months ago.
Right, so they were both first-generation migrants.
Oh yes, yes. Dad came out about 1906, and he'd lived here and worked here, Toowoomba and Melbourne and Ballarat and places like that. And then he'd gone over to New Zealand just before the 1418 war, and he joined up there.
Were they politically active, your parents?
I don't know if you could say they were politically active. They joined a group called the State Labour Party at one stage, and I rather think that it was a sort of either breakaway or an attempt at respectability by a very left wing of the Labour Party, or perhaps even a right wing of the Communist Party. I'm not sure. But they didn't last long in it because they didn't like the sort of surveillance that the members seemed to make of each other. You know, the constant having to explain what you did. You know, I remember, Dad resigned in a huff from them, and we were always interested in politics in the household, but certainly we were anti-Lyonses and anti... Joe Lyons was, of course, the UAP, or was then the Liberal, now the Liberal Party, Prime Minister, and he was followed by Menzies. And of course Menzies made such an absolute disaster of the war that he was given the heave-ho, and Curtin came in. And we were much more enthusiastic about that. But we were always left-wing, and I remember feeling at school, particularly with the almost pro-fascist leanings of the school teachers at that time, that it was as well to keep quiet.
Can you remember any election campaigns?
I can remember. I can remember the attempt to get Curtin in. Curtin came in first of all on the crossing of the floor of two independents, but the election after that, yes, I can remember that one. And in Springfield Avenue there were considerable political rallies of all sides. I can remember, just after the war, when Menzies was trying to make his comeback in 1948, 49, the rallies there.
What was an election rally like in those days? I mean, because people there was no TV and...
No. The little meetings, and of course at that time the Domain was very, very important in its own way. You had all the rat bags about the place there, the flat earthers and the Communist Party, and every now and again the Labour Party, particularly at election times. You had one gentleman spruiking something called attichism, which apparently meant money without interest, which of course would be of no interest to any banker. But you had all that sort of thing going on. But newspapers were used a great deal. The radio was used quite a bit by the major parties to push their views. But apart from that, the public appearances were the important things.
And would people just go into streets and start talking on street corners and Springfield Avenue?
Well, Springfield Avenue was almost not quite a cul-de-sac, but almost so, and quite a reasonable place for a meeting without having without stopping the main traffic. Now, if you tried to do it in the middle of Darlinghurst Road at that time, you would have probably been stopped and moved on by the police because you were hindering traffic, but not in Springfield Avenue.
What sort of discipline was used in your home?
Oh, I never remember my father hitting me. He'd speak to us from time to time. My mother hit us regularly.
So she was the disciplinarian?
Yes. But you know, if things were serious, your father was going to have a word with you, and of course, Dad's words were invariably very kind. No, don't do that again, son. Your mother worries. That sort of thing.
Oh dear. Well, what sort of things would get you into trouble with your mum?
Oh, being out late would be one of them. Making a mess of the room, and particularly living in flats as we did. I suppose eating. Oh, cut it out. Come on. I suppose eating things that were being saved for another occasion. You know, arriving at the Bicky jar when people were coming, that sort of thing.
Were you expected to contribute to the family in any way? Like you were growing up, say the late 30s. Like some kids had newspaper runs or collected bottles or anything like that.
No, we had a marvellous advantage at Kelburn Hall. We collected all the bottles that turned up, but they were for our birthday and Christmas presents and so on, so that we could splurge out on those. But all that money went into our bank account. We didn't contribute financially to the household at all, which was, I suppose, a bit unusual. We were given 7p a week. Pocket money, 6p to go to the pictures and a penny to spend.
Your mother only had the two children,
yes.
And the one birth, you being twins. Was she unable to have more children, or did?
No, I think I think at one stage she was expecting another, but it must have been a miscarriage. You know. I remember her saying, "How would you like a little sister?" But, you know, which seems like a bit of an opening. But which I suppose we were about 5 or 6 at the time. But certainly nothing eventuated. So whether or not she had a miscarriage or not, I don't know.
Because that's quite unusual, just two in the family
Yes.
at that time.
Yes.
I was just wondering if she knew something about contraception that nobody else did.
No. I'd imagine jumping off wardrobes may have been the limit of it.
Yeah. How did the Depression affect your family? It sounds as though your family came through it. Was your father able to remain in work? Or?
Oh, no. Dad had been a chief steward with the Union Steamship Company. And when we were born, he resigned from that, and he went to work for Hotel Australia and after that a place called Paris House. But then, of course, the Depression hit, and there wasn't much call for his services either as a waiter or as a chief waiter or anything of the sort. So by chance he was able to get into that cinema thing, that acting as a chief usher or manager, whatever it was, at Roselle.
And your housing would have been subsidised by your mother managing the
well, we had a flat at Kelburn Hall when we moved there. That must have been about 1933, I would think. And she received £1 a week, which meant virtually that she was on call for 24 hours a day. We had a phone, and at that time I think it was the only phone in the building, and there were 16 flats, and of course the flats were fairly big, and some of them were let out as separate rooms by various landladies in the building. So there must have been something like 70, 80 people living in that building. and all of them from time to time would want use of the phone.
Yes, that's been pretty demanding. Yeah. And she wouldn't have had to pay rent.
No, didn't pay rent. No, and light and gas were paid for by the owner. Initially, the building was owned by a fellow called Malik, but he was in strife with his bank, and I think it was eventually sold to Sydney Council, and perhaps it still is. That would be South Sydney now, since they own that area.
Yeah. What did the family do for fun?
For fun? Well, we went to the pictures once a week, and that'll be enough. Kelly, yes, you've made your point. Another dog came by.
What were you doing for fun?
We played marbles, and we played cricket, and we played all the usual kids' games in season.
What about this family? Did the family do anything together?
Yes. We'd every Sunday we'd either go to Watson's Bay or Neilson Park or something like that. We seemed to go a great many times to the gardens. I suppose that was probably the cheapest and most economical one. We'd invariably spend an hour of the Domain going round the various spruikers. We'd go to the art gallery in wet weather. And,
what was the art gallery like then?
Oh, not as exciting as it is now. It seemed to be filled with things like Rorke's Drift, a picture about the South African War, things like the arrival of the Queen of Sheba, and the Sons of Clovis, great gloomy Victorian masterpieces, and of course plenty of the Gumnut School, the Streetons and the Tom Robertses and so on. But I always enjoyed going. I always liked going into the art gallery. And of course the museum was there too. That was another useful place.
And what was that like at that time?
Much the same, I think, as it is now. Perhaps the exhibitions weren't quite as exciting as they seem now, but it still has that cold, tomb-like atmosphere that I remember as a kid. Yeah. We used to like the Technological Museum very much because seeing all the various things, particularly the Strasbourg clock, which we'd go and look at and wonder at, that sort of thing. Sunday, of course, was a pure close down as far as any other entertainment was concerned. There was no cinema. As far as I know, the only entertainment in drama would be the new theatre, which was down in Pitt Street, down near the quay, and they must have been pretty poor, having measured the space, where they were for my own work, it must have been quite remarkable that they attempted to stage anything in that particular area.
And did you go to plays at the new theatre?
Well, I can only ever remember going to one, and I think it must have been Clifford Odets's Awake and Sing, but I'd be guessing at that. I remember being absolutely bored by it. I had been taken to see, I think, Cinderella and one or two other things of the Tivoli pantomimes, and thinking, oh, these were marvellous, whereas the theatre experience at the New was absolute boredom for me. But I suppose I must have been about 9 or 10 at the time.
And would your mother and father take you to those things?
Oh, yes. When they could afford it, which was pretty rare. The best they could do for us was the cinema. Thank God they did, because I think I got my real education there. But, the radio was good. You had serials and plays from morn till midnight pretty well on the radio.
Can you remember some of the ones that you liked?
Oh yes, The Search for the Golden Boomerang, which was a kid's show, then we had Martin's Corner, which was one of the original soapies, and Dad and Dave, which we liked very much, Mrs. Hobbs, and, which was quite funny. Mrs. Hobbs was played by an old pantomime dame. I think his name was Dan Elgar or Edgar, a name like that. But, yes, that was something we really liked. But we were amongst the last in our street to get a radio. It was about 1937 when we got ours. And we were glued to it, your ear practically stuck to the thing. Of course, the radio sat in the corner of the room and you grouped your chairs around it and you looked at it. It was the centrepiece of conversation. It killed conversation, of course, but we all sat looking at the thing.
Seems odd, doesn't it?
Yes, the idea of putting it aside, just didn't dawn on people. They were quite splendid pieces of furniture, some of them.
Big cases.
Oh, big cases, yes, and inlays and all that sort of thing. Then, of course, later on, we never had one, but later on the radiograms came in and they were even more bulbous than the old radio.
Yeah. So it sounds as though your parents were into culture, if you like.
Yes, we couldn't afford it, but they did what they could. And we had books, and I think the biggest discovery I had as a kid was finding the old municipal library. Mum and Dad didn't know about it. It was just one of the kids in the flats. His mother used to bring him home books, and I thought they looked pretty good, and found out where you got them from. And when I found that out, I used to get myself down to the municipal library as often as possible.
Where is it?
It used to be in the old Queen Victoria building, and it was above Penfold's wine cellars, and you had this marvellous smell of vintage wine in the cellars seeping up through the building. The building itself inside was quite decrepit, and it was a palace of wonders for me. It was marvellous to discover that. It annoyed me a great deal that it must have been in first year at high school at St Mary's that I discovered it, but none of the brothers ever mentioned it. And there it was, practically at the end of the street as far as they were concerned.
Yes. You've talked about listening to the radio. What would you typically do in the evening? Say before you got the radio.
Oh.
What would happen in the evening in your household?
I suppose you'd play. You'd either do your homework, and I don't suppose kids in primary school had much homework to do. You would play cards, games like Ludo and Snakes and Ladders and that sort of thing. But no, I can't really recall what we actually did. I remember Mum used to always seem to be darning socks. That seemed to be quite a regular thing for her. Those days, of course, it was always woolen socks, and woolen socks are invariably whole in a matter of hours of use, and she always seemed to be repairing those. Dad would just be reading the paper. That would be about it. Reading, of course, we did a fair bit of that.
What were your favourite books and authors?
As a kid? Well, of course, I started off with Anderson and Grimm, like those. I don't remember Alice in Wonderland. I suppose we may have done it. I very much liked, as an adolescent, the Biggles Adventures. I thought they were marvellous. We had also about 6 or 7 volumes of Greyfriars Annuals, all about Billy Bunter and Harry Wharton and the upper remove and the lower removes and so on, all about it. English public schools, which completely alien to us, but seemed marvellous when you read about them. But I remember reading story of San Michele is when I was quite young. I must have been about 11. Enjoyed it.
Mm.
At 14, I got hold of a copy of Ulysses when it was about to be banned. There was public meetings about it and so on. And I read it from cover to cover, and I don't suppose I understood more than one word in 5 out of the whole thing, but I was very smug in the playground telling kids I've read it.
Yeah. In the family, who controlled the finances?
Mum.
Well, what happened to your father's pay pack? Would he bring home his pay pack?
He'd give it to her, and he'd usually keep a pound or so for himself, and he'd provide for his cigarettes and so on. And I imagine his gambling. No, he never gambled excessively, but he always seemed to do reasonably well with it. Saturday afternoon.
Did your father like his employment, his work?
I think so, yes, I think he did. He seemed to get on well with people.
What?
He seemed to get on well with people. He seemed to, like contact with people all the time. Mm. But he never said he didn't.
Mm. What impact? We had to change his job because of the depression.
Mm.
Overall, what kind of an impact did the depression have on your family?
My mother never got over it. She always regarded it as, pure terror. The idea of being unemployed was something that she felt was, absolutely unbelievable. See, she was virtually on her own here, in New Zealand particularly, but of course she had work there. But coming over here and then losing whatever they'd saved in this boarding house they'd had, horrified her.
What do you mean they lost it?
Well, she invested their savings and so on into running a boarding house, and it just collapsed. Their clientele couldn't pay their rent, and she had debts, and eventually had to walk away from it.
Mm. Yeah. Did you always have enough food?
Oh yes. I never remember being hungry. Always plenty of fruit, vegetables, all that sort of stuff.
And your father remained in employment?
Yes, never well paid. In fact, there was an alleged basic wage, but I don't think either Mum or Dad ever got it. And of course they worked extremely long hours.
Mm. What was a typical meal in your family?
Oh, well, Sunday we always had a roast. It would either be roast beef or roast lamb. And the lamb always seemed to be much bigger then than it is now. Indeed, you wished it wasn't quite so big, because the use of it extended from Sunday pretty well till Wednesday. It would go through various stages, cold meat on Sunday evening with salad, and then you'd have it warmed up with gravy on Monday. After that you'd have it as shepherd's pie and so on. And of course they've always baked vegetables, potato, pumpkin, beans, peas, all that sort of thing. I don't ever remember seeing a zucchini as a kid. No, I was totally unaware of them until I was married some 30 years later.
Can you describe your mother's working day?
Yes, you'd start very early in the morning. We had to have a cleaner in for the flats, and she'd help with the cleaning. And that would be round about 7. The milk people would be delivering the milk, and the bread people would arrive soon after that with the bread, and she'd have to make sure that all of those flats were serviced. And then she'd have to, well, I suppose it was Monday, she'd collect rents and so on. And if there were flats empty, she'd have to get them papered and prepared for the next tenant, and try and get the flat rented as quickly as possible. That often proved difficult because they were big flats, and unless you had a reasonable sized family or running a boarding house, you know, the flats then were about £3 to £4 a week, which were very small these days, but immense then.
Yeah.
The basic wage, I think, was around about £4. So.
Who were your friends?
Mainly school kids, or perhaps some of the children that were in the flats, and they were pretty transigent. They went through bit by bit. So I can remember one of the girls in the flat who was brought up by her grandmother. You know, she was a great friend for us.
And what sort of things would you do with your friends?
Oh, play the usual games, you know, hide and seek, rounders. You know, down the park you could play cricket and that sort of thing.
What park was that?
Rushcutters Bay.
Was it safe for kids to go down there?
Yes, yes. I remember once one of our friends being almost molested, not quite, by some fellow at the far end of Rushcutters Bay, but I don't remember anything other than that.
Were there places that you weren't allowed to go?
Can't think of any.
Or any people that you had to avoid?
No, I don't remember anything like that.
How far did you roam as a child? Well, what was your territory?
Oh, well, we could do, Rushcutters Bay, of course, was a big spot for us. Elizabeth Bay, around to Elizabeth Bay Crescent. We'd, as we got older, we'd go as far as Darling Point. Later on, we'd catch trams out to Watson's Bay and attempt to walk back to King's Cross along the bay, the edge of the bay. When we were, must have been about 12, 13, we'd catch trams out to La Perouse. That was a fairly lengthy trip, or better still, a tram trip out to Ryde. And Ryde was exciting because there were cows out there and sheep.
Gee. Can you remember any adventures that you had on these trips?
No, not particularly. You know, I remember at La Perouse we rather liked it, particularly on a Sunday, because they had a ventriloquist there on the beach, you know, and I suppose these were down and out theatricals. We had fellows with dancing dogs, and and of course the snake charmers. I think the snake charmer is still there, but you know, that seemed quite exciting to us.
Well, where did you go to school?
We went to school, first of all, for primary school to St Canice's. It was run by the Sisters of Charity. They came down from St Vincent's, and they went through till 6th class, from infants through to 6th class. Usually boys left at the end of 4th class and went off to the brothers. We remained, my brother and I, till 6th class. I suppose it was a matter of convenience for my mother, and didn't go to the brothers till first year high school.
And that was at St Mary's?
St Mary's, yes.
And what was it like there?
A shock to the system after ruling the roost, I suppose, at St Canice's. We were treated with considerably more freedom at St Canice's than we had at the brothers. It was a rigorous sort of school. I've realised now that the poor devils had 60 in the class, and the educational system, if you could call it that, was pretty backward, but it was backward everywhere. You you had a rigid set of novels and plays and so on. You'd usually do one novel a year, one play a year, and so on. And that was it. And plenty of exercises in grammar and composition writing. I don't think we ever called them essays. We did geography, we did history, and history was something called the British history up till the present day, from the glorious revolution of 1688 and so on, by a fellow called Robertson Curry. If you want sleeping material, I'd recommend it.
Did you like your schooling?
I liked some of it. I don't think I enjoyed school. I remember, Sunday evenings always seemed to be very short, thinking, my God, I've got Monday to face at school again. And
Yet you went on to be a teacher.
yes, but I left school at 14 and 8 months, and first of all I went to work at a printing establishment, and I didn't like that. So I went to the taxation department as a very junior clerk, messenger, I suppose, and worked there for about 18 months. This was during the war years. And after that, I decided I hated the clerical life, so I was apprenticed to woodworking machining in a place called Bran Holidays over in Rushcutters Bay, in McLaughlin Avenue, and worked there for 8 years.
Mm. So you went later on to tertiary education?
Yes. I got the bullet in 1951, and there was a recession, and I went to work as, first of all, as a laboratory attendant at Sydney University, and then they made me a laboratory assistant. And I'd been doing some acting for since I was 16, and I started getting a bit of work with the radio people. The university were very good to me. I worked in the pathology department there, and they used to give me time off to go and do radio sessions. It gave me 3 or 4 months off to go off on a tour for the Arts Council and did that. Mm. So, no, I enjoyed that. I started to work for the Workers' Educational Association, producing plays for them, and did that for 4 or 5 years. And I reached the point where I thought, radio started collapsing, and once television came in. So I thought, do I want to go on and do work as a laboratory assistant or something else? So I thought I don't think I could bear to do pathology for the rest of my life. And did my HSC and then went into, it was called the Leaving Certificate then, of course. And then went to college for a couple of years. Did my Teachers College certificate, and once I was out of that, I realised that to advance at all in the department you needed a degree, so I did my degree at night.
You've had quite an interesting career. Mm. Before, you mentioned to me earlier about one of your teachers at St Kenneth's. Mm. You said, yeah.
Oh yes, Miss Proctor. The nuns seldom seem to have, the full complement of teachers for classes, and I gather they must have gathered these odd bods, these odd ladies, lay people, mainly because they could control a class, or so they thought, or perhaps because they were cheap, one or the other. Remember, they only charged 6pence a week for schooling in all the known arts to mankind. So I dare say they didn't have a great many funds for the lay teachers. This particular Miss Proctor was a youngish lady, but very like the flappers of P.G. Woodhouse, fixoline curls on either side of her face, and makeup to the nines, and she used to sit and listen to us reading. I don't think she ever really followed what was going on the, in the reading, because some of the girls just couldn't, and some of the boys, of course, didn't. But she'd sit there and make herself up and look at her nails, and every now and again she'd turn and look at the statue of the Virgin Mary and think she looks rather pallid, and having done her own makeup, and would flap the rouge puff on the Virgin's face, which amused me a great deal at the time. Of course, as a kid in second class, you don't really cast comments about your elders, but it struck me as being very odd indeed.
Yeah, I think it's marvellous. It's a wonder there wasn't somebody noticed.
Well, I don't know how long Miss Proctor stayed there, but she seemed to be there for about a year, but either she got married or she was given the heave-ho, one or the other.
Yeah. You know how you said before that you started acting and getting involved in drama at 16?
Yeah.
How did that come about?
Oh, well, I was keen on it from the start. The nuns at St. Canice's encouraged me into what was called then elocution. We had elocution classes, and I used to be trotted out to read to visiting people and so on, and turned up in various little playlets, I suppose. They could have only been sketches at school. And then when I went to high school, God alone knows why, but I was cast as Shylock in the school production of Merchant of Venice, and enjoyed that immensely.
Oh, gee.
And then I joined a group called Brian's Playhouse. They were down at in Phillip Street in the Quay, and I must have been about 15 at the time. And I was given parts straight away. I'd imagine it was because everybody else was away at the war at the time. That must have been about 1940, 42, 43.
It's interesting that the brothers give you the part of Shylock. I wonder if they were being not too subtle.
Probably not.
What did your parents say?
Oh, they enjoyed it. They thought I did well with it. Yes.
Did most of the local kids go to those schools, St. Canice's and St. Mary's?
No. As far as the local Catholic kids in and around that area, St. Canice's, they certainly went. There were a number of non-Catholics who went to it too, probably because they felt it was a nicer school, nicer in inverted commas, than Darlinghurst or Glenmore Road, or, well, I suppose the only other one, no, wouldn't be terribly close, but of course the old Palmer Street School. But for St. Mary's, the bulk of the kids seemed to come from Mascot. There were quite a few from Woolloomooloo, but in the main, most of them seemed to come from places like Mascot.
Now, can you remember celebrating, or any rituals, either celebrating particular days like Arbor Day or Wattle Day or Empire Day?
Oh, St. Patrick's Day used to be celebrated regularly. It was lovely because we had a holiday on St. Patrick's Day in the Catholic system. I remember Arbor Day being mentioned from time to time, and we had at that time a school magazine that used to come out every month, and this was published in the Catholic system. There was also a school magazine published monthly in the state system as well. They'd mention things like Wattle Day and Arbor Day and so on, have poems, etc. in there.
But you wouldn't actually physically do anything?
No, I can't remember. It was all rushing out and planting trees or anything like that.
Can you remember any kind of mass displays put on for visiting VIPs and maypole dancing and that kind of thing?
Oh yes, St Patrick's Day was a big thing. You know,
How was it celebrated?
They'd have maypole pole dancing and so on out of the showground, and the races and sports and all that sort of thing for the schools. It was quite a big day, and there was a shield for the winning of the most points that went to various schools.
Maybe a sort of a big combined Catholic kind of thing.
A big combined Catholic thing, yes. There was also, I think it was in 1938, at St Canis's, I think it was called a pageant speculatum or some such blasted name. It was to celebrate the 100 years of the nuns being here in Australia, and they had a big do at the town hall with pageants of the various states. You know, kids dressed up in all sorts of rather odd things. St Canis's, for example, was the Northern Territory, and I remember some of the girls coming through with loaves of bread painted with gilt to suggest the gold that was coming from that particular state, and so on. But it was quite a big thing in the town hall at the time. The apostolic delegate was there as chief guest, and the Archbishop of Sydney, of course, and so on.
Was there much Catholic state school rivalry?
Oh, they were always referred to not as public school, as the state school, and there was always a degree of sneer, I think, in the reference to the state school children. But no, I don't think there was much rivalry about them at all. There's more rivalry, I'd imagine, between the various schools, Catholic schools about the place.
What about in terms of suburbs? I mean, were there areas that had a different sort of social status? Like, did the kids from, Elizabeth Bay and Potts Point fight with the kids from Woolloomooloo or Surrey Hills or Darlinghurst? Do you know how sometimes there's that sort of
Yes. No, there were gangs, but no, I don't remember anything of that sort.
Were there areas that were considered wilder than your area or better than your area?
Oh, Darlow was always considered wilder than Elizabeth Bay, and was or not, I don't know.
Were you ever encouraged to not mix with kids from a particular area?
No.
Okay. What about, was there any sex education?
Yes, you were told not to do anything naughty.
They didn't specify exactly what naughty was?
No. You learned nothing about reproduction at all.
Really? Even from your parents?
No, they'd get embarrassed about it, I think. The first time I learned really anything about reproduction was when I went to work, and I suppose you could say I was learning it from the gutter up.
Before you mentioned something about, when we talk about contraception, you talked about jumping off the wardrobe. I mean, what do you, can you remember hearing anything about abortion?
No, not at all, no.
And unwanted pregnancies. What about girls, when you were in your teenage years, what happened to girls who
there were rumours of people being sent into state. There was a well-known abortionist who went into jail down in his name, what was it? He was a doctor, and he and his wife were running virtually an abortion clinic down in Evan Street, just near Rushcutters Bay. And, I can't recall his name now, it doesn't matter much. But he did a jail sentence for it. There was a rumour of one Macquarie Street man sending a girl out to the harbour and dropping her there, outside the heads. Apparently the abortion failed and the body was just dumped off the heads.
Gee.
No, but, it was a tremendous shame, apparently, for people at that time.
Yeah. You know how you made that sort of light-hearted comment about people jumping off wardrobes? Well, a few people have made that comment. I mean, is it just a myth, or is it just a saying?
I don't know. I just don't know, I rather think, they were desperate. Some of them were desperate to get rid of the fetus, or whatever means.
You sort of imagine these women sort of perched precariously on top of wardrobes and sort of leaping.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's just sort of a saying.
Yes, just a saying. But whether anyone actually did it or not, I don't know.
Well, I've been told they did.
Yes, I'd imagine probably there was a degree of truth in it, but certainly I don't know.
What sort of a neighbourhood was it? Was it residential or industrial or mixed?
Elizabeth Bay?
Yeah.
Totally residential.
Right.
Yes.
And was there a social focus of the area?
No, I wouldn't think so, no.
No place where people would meet and talk and gossip? Or...
No, except in the streets and, in the homes. It seemed to be a lot more entertaining at home than anywhere else. There weren't, at that time, there weren't the numbers of restaurants and so on that we have now. As far as the social elite were concerned, I suppose the two main places for them would be the Romano's restaurant just off Martin Place, or Prince's in Martin Place. They seem to be the places where the photographers went for the Sunday papers.
Was it an affluent area?
Oh, Elizabeth Bay was, yes. A lot of them were poverty-stricken, but keeping up fronts. No, you couldn't say they were really as well off as all that, but they certainly tried to behave as if they were.
Would you say that there was a sense of community there? Did you... You know how you said that you couldn't be naughty because people would... That implies...
Yes. You seem to know the people round about. If you didn't know them to speak to, you knew them by sight. And there was very much at that time a sense of a village about Elizabeth Bay and Potts Point and so on.
That implies a fairly stable population, even though there was high rental.
Yes. I think it probably was. Probably was a stable place, as a kid you didn't think about that.
Well, where did most people work?
They seemed to work in offices, I suppose. Very few of them seemed to be in trades. I remember one woman in the building ran a group of restaurants called Kookaburra. They were cake shops and cheap restaurant. But, in the main, you'd have people, shopkeepers, and working as machinists here, there, and yon. But in the main, I'd say most of them would be office workers.
And did the women and men work? Wives.
Wives tended not to, although in and around our place, I suppose most of them did some sort of work, but in the main, no, they'd be available for the kids. I think that was one of the advantages Mum felt about the managing the block of flats, was that she was always there.
It would seem, would you say, was it a mixture of affluence and also were there working people there?
Oh, yes. Yes, I suppose that would be a fair description.
What about all these stories one hears about the Cross being very bohemian and lots of artists and that? Was that your experience of it?
Yes. Well, particularly when we moved to Wild Street, we had Sally Herman, the landscapist, next to us, and we had Bernard Smith, who later became a well-known critic, right above us. Yes, there were. We knew there were artists painting and so on. I suppose we rather liked the idea that these people.
7th of July 1995.
29th.
29th.
Yes.
We're talking about some of the artists residents in the area. Did you know any of them?
Well, Sally Herman I knew, and Smith, the art critic. They invited us from time to time to various parties they had for different painters. We met Dobo and we met Hal Messingham and people like that.
It must have made it.
Oh, it was quite exciting, quite interesting.
What about actors?
Actors, no. There were plenty of actors up and down Macquarie Street, and you'd know them by sight. For instance, Grant Taylor, he was in the film 40,000 Horsemen, he lived up there. Lloyd Lamble, a well-known actor of the time, he lived around the area. Edwin Stiles, who was my hero, used to go to the Minerva Theatre when I was a bit older, when I was about 14 or 15. He seemed to be in everything they did. I liked him a great deal. A fellow called Ross Buchanan, who gave one of the finest performances I've seen in a play. He lived there.
What attracted people, so many artistic people and creative people, to the area, do you think?
I suppose it was its freedom, and remember, at that time, Sydney had very little nightlife at all. Everything died, whereas there you could always go out and have a cup of coffee. There you could always have a meal, that sort of thing.
And what do you mean because of its freedom? What do you mean by that?
Well, the idea of, people going home at 6 o'clock and closing the front door and sitting and watching TV, well, no TV, radio, or listening to the radio for a couple of hours and then going to bed, whereas at the Cross, life went on till midnight afterwards if you wanted to. There were drug problems there at the time, but nothing like we have now.
What kind of drugs?
Well, snow was the popular one, apparently.
Cocaine?
Yes, we never heard, it wasn't pushed at people, it was there. There was prostitution in and around the Cross, and I think it had existed there since 1900, but again, it wasn't as heavily pushed until perhaps when the Americans arrived. Then you became much more aware of it during the war years.
Second World War?
Second World War. We had, for a while, a bordello in the flat beneath us.
Oh, yes.
Yes. And the girls seemed to operate on some sort of roster. They seemed to be there for about a week or so, and then they'd move around. Another group would come in, then another group, and then the same group would come back. We had nothing to do with them.
How did growing up in such an area with the diversity in the life and everything, what sort of impact or influence do you think that's had on your life?
That's a hard one to say. Its advantage, I suppose, was that you were handy to the library, you were handy to the museum, you were handy to the art gallery, you knew where these were, whereas numbers of kids who live in the suburbs never had that. We knew all about the State Library, we used it, and we knew all about the museum, we used that, and the art gallery. We were close. We had a good cinema at the Cross. We were close enough when we were slightly older to be able to go into town on our own, that sort of thing. We liked that. able to do our own shopping in town when we were about 12, 13. The transport was good, whereas in the city, if you lived in the suburbs, it was a day's trip to come into town.
Yeah. The police, you know how you talked about your father's betting and everything, that would have been with an SP booking.
Oh, yes, yes. I don't think anyone ever worried about that at the time.
And the prostitution, well, what was the crime rate like so-called crime?
Cars were pinched from time to time, and I believe they usually ended up in Melbourne or something like that. There were robberies of flats. People would get in and strip them bare, but in general, you weren't aware of a great deal of crime. There must have been about, but you weren't aware of it. You read of it.
Well, what was the attitude to the police? I mean, were the police viewed as people that you could go to for help, and could you trust the police, or were the police viewed as
generally, as far as the area was concerned, you felt much better with the police than without. During the war, it seemed to change a bit. You seemed to feel that they were probably grafting a bit, but certainly not as not before the war.
So you weren't afraid of them?
No.
Well, what sort of employment was available for kids?
Pretty limited, I suppose if you were a girl, you went into a shop, or you did hairdressing or something of the sort. If you were a boy, they'd probably try and push you into a trade of some sort. Very few people went to university. Very few children went beyond the intermediate. Most, I would say perhaps no more than 10% did their leaving certificate at that time. You go and work in a shop, an office.
What was the ethnic mix of the area?
Probably King's Cross, Darlinghurst, and so on was much more ethnically mixed than perhaps the other suburbs. For example, we had delicatessens, whereas other suburbs had pork and beef shops. And I remember Woolloomooloo used to be called Little Italy at that time because a great many Italian fishermen lived down in that area.
Can you remember the Lo Schiavos?
Virgil Lo Schiavo, I remember him as being a fencer. I joined the Swords Club I think they were in Hunter Street at that time. Then they moved up to Castlereagh Street in the Bjelke Peterson Health Studios. It was run, I think, by Joe's brother.
Yeah.
No, it was quite a big thing at the time. And I was a member of that, and he was apparently a very good sabre man, but I only saw him in passing. But he painted two pictures. One was characters from Dickens, and one was characters from Shakespeare that I at Sydney University in the Union Building. And I think with one of them he won the Sulman Prize for mural. But apart from that, I know next to nothing about him.
What smells can you remember?
Oh, my favourite smell as a child was Oxford Street on a Friday night. There was a fish shop called Murrell's, and right next to it a sweet shop called, I think it was Crawford's. And the mixture of fish and the sugar of the sweet shop, something I'll never ever forget, was absolutely indescribable. But you knew you were in Oxford Street the moment it hit you. We used to do most of our shopping on Friday night in Oxford Street.
They had night shopping there?
On Friday nights. Till, I think it was till about 8 o'clock, 8:30, something like that.
What was the shopping precinct, if you like, on Oxford Street? What was it like at that time?
It was good. There were several drapers. There was a place called Arnold's. Beberfalls, I think, was there. Yes, there were about 3. Wynn's store, that was quite a big one there. And of course plenty of fruit and vegetable places, and seemed to be packed with butcher shops.
Did most people do their shopping up there on Oxford Street rather than in Darlinghurst Road?
I think so. There was a big grocer shop called Macquarie's, and they used to send out fellows. We had one chap who used to come every week to advise Mum about the specials and so on, and you could have it delivered, and it was, a minimal delivery fee. But,
and what was Darlinghurst Road like? What was the King's Cross shops?
That was quite good. A few decent fruit shops there, and butchers were reasonable, so on. It was a bright, happy sort of place, I always thought. The marvellous Arabian cafe, of course, but that seemed to come to life after dark rather than during the day.
What was so wonderful about the Arabian?
Oh, the coffee was marvellous. You floated on it. It was thick and black and lovely, and a nice place to meet. And there was another place called the Kismet round in Macquarie Street. It wasn't bad. Rowie Norton did the decor for the Kismet.
Where were major purchases made? I mean, and in terms of your house or your flat,
yes.
What did you have in ways of appliances and furniture?
Oh, well, I remember when Mum got an actual ice box. She put a doily on top and a bunch of flowers, and they were in a vase. Before that, we had a meat safe which hung under the back stairs, and you had a towel or sack or something draped over it to keep it cool. But once the icebox came, that was a marvellous improvement. We didn't get a refrigerator until must have been after the war, around about 1945, and it was a silent night. No gas one.
Yeah. And with most of the big purchases like that, where would they come from?
Well, I suppose David Jones or Grace Brothers, people like that.
Right. Can you remember any local characters?
No. We had one woman in the building who was allegedly a poet of some sort, and Mrs. Lorimer. She seemed to be always slopping around in slippers and an overcoat, and always had a cigarette in her mouth. And she must have been 70 then. Come some public event like Anzac Day or something, she'd throw off a poem that I suppose she had printed privately, and it'd be sold as copies, that sort of thing. But no actual characters, no. Oh, a fellow called the Bengal Tiger down in the Domain. He used to spruik poetry, whether it was his own or Henry Lawson's, I never quite knew, but he used to be there week in, week out. An enormous black overcoat, and he must have been all of 4'7" in height, and he swigged from a little bottle that we thought may have been oil, but suspected was rum.
Yeah. What about, were there any local crims that you knew of?
No. My father knew what was her name, Tilly Devine, and her husband Jim, but not intimately. He'd always had a degree of respect for Tilly. She seemed to be generous to the poor. But I didn't know them personally.
What sounds can you remember?
Oh gosh, that's a hard one. No, I can't say. You know, during the war they'd have the sirens every now and again. You know, either as a air raid practice or an actual air raid. And apart from that, I can't remember any particular sound.
What were the war years like?
Well, we really suffered, you know, during the war years. We were denied pink icing for a start, and had to do without Santa Clauses in the shops at Christmas time. And, you know, that was a real problem. But in actual fact, we were rationed. You were only allowed so much meat, but it was a marvellous ration compared to what they had in Britain and elsewhere. We were rationed in butter, we were rationed in tea, but...
Can you remember the outbreak of the war and how people felt?
Yes, I remember them being quite upset. You know, I think we were staying with some people up at Kellyville at the time. It was holidays, if I remember rightly, about September. And the woman we were staying with was quite upset because she suspected, and rightly so, that her husband was going to join up.
Can you remember the Japanese getting into the harbour and
Yes, I do. We spent the night under the stairs at Kelburn Hall, and wondering what was happening. Knew something was going on.
Were you frightened?
Uneasy, I suppose. I don't suppose we were really terrified. One old lady from the flats said something that rather shook us a bit. "I'm sure I heard Ashdown crumble." And you know, I remember that phrase quite well, and thought, no, Ashdown was a fairly new block of flats up there, and I thought, God, if that's crumbled, the rest of us won't be long behind it. But Ashdown is still there as far as I know.
Yes. Were people, what was the effect of the Japanese getting involved in the war? Did people get more worried then? I mean, did people take the war seriously?
Oh,
from the
yes,
outset?
yes. When, particularly when they advanced so quickly, property values in the eastern suburbs plummeted. You know, you could have got any sort of flat you liked, you know, right on the harbour for something like £1 a week. No, the cognoscenti took to the hills. They went like mad. Properties up in Bowral and so on, I imagine, boomed because, you know, they were a bit further away. But yes, there was quite a deal of panic when that happened. But we stayed on through it, and you know.
What was the impact of the American troops coming in?
I don't think we liked it. The black marketeering became more prevalent. You know, they could sell local foods and so on at a dearer rate to the Yanks than the locals could afford. The certainly the Australian soldiers didn't like the Yanks there for the fairly obvious reasons. The Yanks took over a house in Macquarie Street as an American club. The place was called Manar. It had been it was an Italianate style building. Apparently, it had very elaborate ceilings and murals and so on throughout. And they quickly plastered those over and put Donald Duck and Popeye and so on. And it was a centre for the soldiers, sailors, their girlfriends and so on. But I don't think we liked the idea at all.
Did it change the impact of all those troops coming in look for R&R? Did that change the character of the cross, or do you think that came later?
I think it came later. I think the cross managed to survive until perhaps the Vietnam War. I'd imagine from then on it started to go downhill.
Mm. You mentioned holidays. Did you go on holidays regularly, or?
Well, my brother and I would be sent off to Kellyville for our holidays. And Kellyville to us was way out in the bush. It was 25 miles from Sydney. And it was, 10 or 15 miles out of Parramatta.
Who would you stay with there?
One of Mum's former boarders, he was a Scot and had married a Scots woman. And they had a house up there. There was no running water, it was all tap water, tank water. And it was a real dust bowl of a place. But they had cows and they had pigs and chooks and so on. We liked it. For us, it was the country. These days, it's an outer suburb, a fairly pricey one, I believe.
Yes. Did the family ever go away together?
No. I only ever remember Mum having one holiday after she virtually sued her employer. And she went up the mountains on her own. Dad managed the flats while she was away. And I think she came back before the holiday was over.
Mm. And why did she have to sue the employer? What happened there?
Oh, well, they weren't prepared to give holidays.
Right. Oh, yeah.
And, they came to the party and decided, yes, it's fair.
Mm.
But I would say that was about 3 or 4 years after she'd taken the job.
Mm. What can you remember about industrial action or any, at that time? Can you remember hearing about strikes or?
Well, particularly during the war years, there were always complaints about the wharfies going on strike and so on, and not without cause, because the wharfies had the dickens of a job. It was, they had no real facilities for meals. They had no facilities for keeping themselves clean or anything of the sort, and it was a dirty job. Mm. And the method of enlistment for wharfies at that time was pretty terrible. Before the war was virtually the one ganger picking his men and perhaps selling the rights to the others.
Mm.
But with the advent of war, the union came to some sort of agreement to force them through. There were other strikes, of course, rail strikes and that sort of thing, but these were very occasional, much more after the war than before.
Mm.
People couldn't afford to go on strike before the war.
Mm. What were the most popular newspapers?
Oh, the Daily Telegraph would probably be the most popular. The one that was most highly regarded was the Herald. We had the Sun. Later on we had the Mirror. And they were it.
What about magazines?
Magazines, the Woman's Very Weekly would be probably the most popular.
Mm.
The New Idea for women would be a popular one. For barber shops, a magazine called Man was very popular.
Mm. Mm. What about comics?
Oh, comics, yes. We had, in the main, we had English comics until we were adolescents, I suppose, and these would be things like Comic Cuts and Puck and Chatterbox, all very Englishy. And then after that, we seem to come into the, I think it's the King's comics, the incorporated things with Superman and Spider-Man, all that sort of stuff.
Mm. Mm. What songs do you remember?
Oh, Waltzing Matilda, of course. When I Grow Too Old to Dream, the Isle of Capri, Ferryboat Serenade.
Mm. What about, can you remember any jokes or tricks from that kids would play at that time when you were growing up?
Oh, we'd all attempt various magic tricks, that you learnt in the Sunday paper. There'd be some new puzzle or other, but I can't recall any particular ones. No.
Mm-hmm. What did you know of the world outside your local area?
Well, we knew about Spain. My father was very interested in what was happening there. We knew something of what was happening in the US. Dad had one tenant there who used to give him the Chicago Tribune, and we'd go through that pretty well with a fine-tooth comb every week. But we went through the comics. Dad would go through the news. Mm. We were aware of things happening in Europe.
Were you aware of the rise of the fascism?
Oh, yes. I don't suppose as kids we knew what fascism was ourselves, but certainly Dad was aware of it. And we were certainly pro-loyalist and anti-Franco in Spain.
Mm. Mm. And was your father aware of what was happening in Germany with the Jewish people?
Yes.
Were immigrants starting to come out?
Yes, just around about 1938-39 was starting to get immigrants. We called them refos at the time, or refugees. Mm. And they were generally the better off people because they had the funds to get out. Mm. I remember him writing to his sister. She lived in what is now Croatia. It had been part of the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, and she wrote back something like, "We are two old women, no one will ever touch us." And of course, the only information he had after the war was that they were shipped into Poland. That was it.
Mm. God. Yeah. Okay. Well, what can you remember of common illnesses at that time? What
diphtheria was one of the ones that I think most households feared. Pneumonia was a thing that you dreaded to get, apparently. They looked forward to something called the crisis, and you either survived it or you didn't. And I suppose it was fairly even Stevens as to whether you survived or not. There was no antibiotics, of course, no penicillin.
Did you know anyone who actually got diphtheria?
Yes. We had one friend in our class who died of it.
Really?
Yes. And infantile paralysis was another. Poor little bugger got it, and he was in an iron lung for another 20-odd years before he finally died.
Oh, gee.
No, it was there was no cure for it at that time.
Mm. And did the people who got those illnesses, would you say that their diet was poor or their environmental reasons, or were they people that were...
Oh, it's hard to say, but you always assume that people were living the same way as you were, but for some reason or other they collected these things. Mm. I remember Mum had a cookbook, was things she hung up in the kitchen, Country Women's Association cookbook. It had not only various recipes that all the good ladies of the parish had sent in, but also handy hints for dealing with emergencies, including diphtheria, and how you got the child on the kitchen table and slit his windpipe or her windpipe, and remove the membrane and plastered. I forget whether it was kerosene or methylated spirits, but one or the other. And then you used common or garden thread to stitch the wound up. And I kept wondering how on earth any mother could manage to do this.
To God, your mother did.
Yes. That apparently was, the way they dealt with diphtheria.
Yeah. Doesn't sound good.
In the trams there were always signs about tuberculosis and about the dangers of tuberculosis and having regular checks and so on.
Can you remember any deaths amongst your friends' parents? Like, what was it like in terms of, well, accidents and not only car accidents, but say industrial accidents related to working conditions?
No, I don't remember anything like that, no.
Okay. And I was just sort of wondering then if in those days people, had got, heart attacks and cancer, and if they got it earlier, like did people live longer now? So
yes.
Were people considered old when they were 55 then?
It always struck me when people got married, they seemed terribly old, I suppose that's, they were probably in their 20s, but, we always thought they looked about 40, but whether that was so or not, it's hard to say. But, no, I can't remember any people dying of cancer and so on, but obviously it was one of the killers of the time. It was never mentioned. It was, almost a social faux pas to suffer from something like cancer.
What impact did the car have on your lifestyle?
Well, we didn't have one.
What about on the area? Because over the time you were there, it must have been coming more...
Yes. Well, the block of flats the mother managed had 4 or 5 garages, and it was always a damn sight easier to rent those garages than... No, there must have been 8. Always easier to rent those than it was to rent the flats if they were empty. So there were obviously cars about. During the war, of course, petrol was rationed, and a lot of people went in for the charcoal burners and for substitutes of one sort or another. But I would imagine probably that cut down on the numbers of cars during that 39 to 45 period, and then after that the cars started, particularly the Holden, around about 1948-49, began to make its appearance. Motorcycles seemed to be prevalent amongst the working class.
Do you think that the area that was more polluted then than it is now? Talking, say, the 30s.
No, I don't. I don't think you notice the sort of haze that you eternally have now. I remember, we used to have great fluffy white clouds, and they really were white, and, you could look at them and think of them almost as mountains in your backyard. But these days you seldom see that. Another thing about Sydney Harbour, particularly around Elizabeth Bay, it was a good fishing area. We used to go down to the wharf and either Rushcutters Bay or Elizabeth Bay and fish. You'd get tailor, you'd get flathead, you'd get leather jackets, you'd get all of those. Then they joined the Garden Island to Potts Point and seemed to alter the fishing completely. And bit by bit the harbour seemed to get more polluted.
Well, can you remember the sinking of the Japanese midget sub?
Yes.
Oh, tell us about that.
Well, it was night time, of course, and there was one... We were living at Kelburn Hall at the time, in Elizabeth Bay, and one hell of a racket, and we were all sent down to sit under the stairs in Elizabeth Bay, and we heard the noise going on, and then the following day we heard what had actually happened, that a training boat with, I think, 100-odd sailors had been sunk by the Japanese, and many of the sailors had been killed. The 2 subs had been stopped, and the crew killed in those. Apparently they were aiming at a ship, a US ship called the Chicago, which was loaded to the gunwales with high explosives, and perhaps if they'd have got that, things have been a lot worse.
Mm. Can you remember anything about a ferry load of a ferry full of civilians, women, following a ship going out to wave goodbye?
I think it was called the Hood, but I'm guessing. Yes, and they all ran to one side and tipped over.
Mm.
Yes, I remember that.
Yeah, and they drowned, and sailors jumped up. Did the Americans jump over to save them?
Yes, to save them, but, a great number were lost.
Oh. You don't often hear about those kind of disasters.
There used to be at that time, when I suppose before the war and during the war years, sailing races in the harbour, and ferries used to leave the quay. I remember going on one, and I'd never do it again. They'd run from one side to the other, and the boats would virtually tip either way. So when that event occurred, of course, it reminded me of the events of the ordinary ferry watchers, the sailing watchers.
Mm. What's your happiest memory?
Well, happiest memory? Oh, that's a hard one. No, I suppose my happiest memory was probably doing the school plays. No.
Mm. What about your saddest memory?
Oh, my saddest memory, I think would be when my father died.
How old were you when that happened?
I was 17, 18.
Very young to lose a father.
He was 68 when he died.
Hmm. He must have married late.
Yes. He was about 40.
Okay, I can't think of anything else I want to ask. Is there anything you wanted to say that?
No, I don't think so. I think probably I've said enough.
Oh no. Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you for putting up with that.